In August 1953, the United States government spent exactly $5.3 million to destroy the world's oldest democracy in the Middle East, and then spent the next 26 years pretending it never happened. That number, 5.3 million, is not an estimate. It is not speculation. It comes from a declassified CIA internal history, the Wilbur document, named after the officer who wrote it, Donald Wilbur, and it sat locked in a vault for nearly 50 years before anyone outside of Langley was allowed to read it. What those pages described was a joint American and British intelligence operation, codenamed Ajax by the CIA and Boot by MI6, that toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, in a 72-hour coup, placed a compliant monarch back on the peacock throne, and set in motion a chain of events that would end 26 years later with American hostages blindfolded in Tehran. The cables, the memos, the internal assessments, they don't just show what America did. They show something far more damning. They show that senior U.S. officials knew exactly what they were creating. They wrote it down. They filed it. And then they classified it for half a century. This is what those documents actually say. To understand what America destroyed, you first have to understand what Mohammad Mossadegh actually was. Because the State Department's own internal memos describe him in terms that should make every American deeply uncomfortable. That last bar is the critical one. Dangerously nationalist scored a 10. Potential communist scored a 4. The CIA's own analysts were split. But in the early 1950s, with McCarthy hearings consuming Washington and Korea bleeding American soldiers, 4 was enough. Mossadegh was a 70-year-old lawyer who had studied in Paris and Switzerland. He had spent decades fighting for Iranian constitutional government. He wept openly in Parliament, which the British press used to mock him, calling him hysterical, unstable, a weeping old man, while simultaneously admitting in private cables that he commanded genuine mass devotion. 95% approval in Iranian polling at the peak of the oil nationalization crisis. That is not a rounding error. That is a country unified behind a single idea, that Iranian oil should belong to Iranians. Because here is what had been happening since 1913. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later rebrand itself as BP, had been extracting Iranian oil under a deal so lopsided it almost reads as fiction. Iran received 16% of profits. Britain kept 84%. Iranian workers were barred from senior positions inside their own country's oil industry. British employees lived in segregated housing compounds with swimming pools and clubs. Iranians worked the same fields and slept in open desert camps. In 1950, something changed the equation entirely. Saudi Arabia signed a deal with Aramco, 50-50 profit split. Just like that, every Iranian citizen and politician had a number. 50%. The number Mossadegh began demanding in Parliament. When the British pulled their technicians out and Iran's oil industry ground to a halt, Mossadegh went to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, and he won. The ICJ ruled it had no jurisdiction. Iran had the legal right to its oil. And that is when London called Washington and said, "We need to remove him." The British pitch to the Americans was elegant in its cynicism. They didn't lead with oil, they led with communism. The Wilbur document, the CIA's own classified history of the operation, is remarkably candid about this framing. It acknowledges that the Tudeh Party, Iran's communist faction, was not actually in a position to take power. Mossadegh himself actively kept them at arm's length. But the communist threat was the argument that would open American wallets and American intelligence resources. President Eisenhower was briefed in June 1953. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was fully on board. His brother Allen Dulles ran the CIA. 2 brothers, 1 operation, and an elected foreign leader who had no idea what was being assembled against him. $150,000 to Iranian newspapers. In 1953, money. The CIA funded at least 80% of Iranian newspaper coverage in Tehran during the critical weeks before the coup. Papers that had praised Mossadegh began running cartoons depicting him as a Soviet puppet. Religious leaders who had supported him received cash payments to denounce him from pulpits. That item, spreading a rumor that Mossadegh was Jewish, is in the declassified record. The CIA planted it deliberately, knowing the specific sectarian tensions in Iranian society at the time. This is not interpretation. This is what the Wilbur document describes as psychological warfare, Phase 2. The man running this from the ground was Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, recruited by the OSS in World War II, a man who later described Operation Ajax in a memoir so casually triumphant it reads like a thriller novel. He drove into Tehran in the trunk of a car. He met the Shah in secret, repeatedly, in the middle of the night. He organized what the internal memos call Qashqai tribesmen to amplify street chaos. He was 37 years old, and he was dismantling a democracy. The first coup attempt failed completely. On August 15th, the officers sent to arrest Mossadegh were turned away at his door. The Shah, who had been nervously waiting in his palace, panicked and fled the country, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. He told reporters he had abdicated. The New York Times ran the headline, "American officials quietly began drafting plans to accept Mossadegh as the permanent government." Kermit Roosevelt received a cable from CIA Director Allen Dulles telling him to stand down and destroy evidence. Roosevelt, by his own later account, ignored it. He kept operating with the funds already in country, maintained his networks, and executed a second coup attempt 3 days later. August 19, 1953. The Iranian army moved against Mossadegh's residence. Organized mobs, some paid by CIA funds, some genuinely hostile, flooded Tehran streets. Pro-Shah military officers seized the radio station, the telegraph office, and the key government buildings in a sequence that took less than 9 hours. Mossadegh was arrested at his home. He was tried for treason by a military tribunal. A trial the State Department memos privately acknowledge was predetermined. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, then placed under house arrest until his death in 1967. He never held office again. He was never allowed to leave his home village. The Shah returned to Tehran on August 22nd. American officials met him at the airport. The party began. What the State Department cables from the period between 1953 and 1978 reveal is a 25-year process of American officials increasingly understanding that the Shah was not a solution. He was a pressure cooker, while doing almost nothing to change course. 20 million in 1953. Nearly 6 billion in 1977. Every single dollar of that increased the Shah's capacity to suppress his own population. And American officials knew it. SAVAK, the Shah's secret police, trained and organized with CIA assistance beginning in 1957. The acronym stands for Sazman-e va Amniyat Keshvar, the Organization of National Intelligence and Security. Amnesty International would later estimate that SAVAK maintained a network of 3,000 full-time agents and 60,000 paid informants inside a country of 33 million people. The torture methods documented in Amnesty reports and referenced obliquely in State Department cables of the same period included electric shock, nail extraction, and sleep deprivation. A 1976 State Department Human Rights Assessment, declassified in the 1990s, states that the U.S. Embassy was aware of these practices and that raising them formally with the Shah's government was considered diplomatically counterproductive. Diplomatically counterproductive. That phrase appears across multiple cable chains of the 1960s and 1970s. It is the diplomatic language for, "We don't want to hear about this." The Shah was too useful. He was buying American weapons. He was keeping oil flowing. He was a visible pro-Western monarchy in a region the Cold War had made strategically essential. Nixon's 1969 doctrine explicitly designated the Shah as America's regional policeman in the Persian Gulf. No constraints, no conditions, no human rights requirements. When the Shah requested F-14 fighters, the most advanced American aircraft in service, Nixon approved the sale. The Shah became the first foreign leader allowed to purchase the F-14 Tomcat, $19 billion in weapons, to a government whose own secret police were torturing political prisoners. and the cables documenting this run in unbroken chains from the embassy in Tehran back to Foggy Bottom. Here is where the declassified record becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the documents don't just show what America did. They show what American officials privately said about what America was doing. The 1974 CIA National Intelligence Estimate on Iran. This document, running to dozens of pages, includes a section that reads, in part, as follows. Quote, "The Shah's program of rapid modernization is creating severe social dislocations. The rural migration to urban areas, the displacement of traditional bazaar merchants, and the suppression of all legitimate political expression are combining to produce conditions in which radical opposition may find receptive audiences." End quote. They knew. In 1974, 5 years before the revolution, the CIA wrote this down and filed it, and the policy did not change. December 31st, 1977. President Carter stood in Tehran at a New Year's Eve state dinner hosted by the Shah and gave a toast. The words are in the record. Carter said, and this is a direct quotation, "Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world." 13 months. Carter gave that toast 13 months before the Shah boarded a plane out of Tehran for the last time. When Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, they were looking for something specific, and they found it. The embassy had attempted to shred sensitive documents, but had not completed the process. Iranian students, and this is one of the stranger details of the entire saga, purchased commercial carpet weaving equipment and used it to reweave the shredded documents back together. 18,000 documents. The Iranians published them in a series of volumes they titled Documents from the U.S. Espionage Den. Those volumes, ironically, ended up being one of the most valuable historical records of American covert operations in Iran, precisely because the American government would not declassify its own files for another 3 decades. What those documents confirmed, and what the CIA's own Wilbur document later corroborated, was the comprehensive nature of American involvement in Iranian politics. Station chief communications, lists of Iranian assets, cables discussing specific Iranian politicians and their reliability ratings, manageable opposition figure. That is how the CIA described Ruhollah Khomeini in 1978. The man who would hold 52 Americans hostage for 444 days was, in the embassy's assessment, manageable. 6 million people lined the streets of Tehran when Khomeini landed. 6 million. The largest political gathering in Iranian history to that point. The revolution that American intelligence called unthinkable had just become irreversible. This is the section the thumbnail promised, and the record fully delivers it. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, wrote in his memoirs, and later confirmed in declassified National Security Council memos, that he had begun warning Carter as early as 1977 that the Shah's government was structurally unsustainable. That quote, "structurally unsustainable," appears in a declassified NSC briefing document dated September 1977. March 2000. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stood at a podium and said the following, now on the record, fully. The Eisenhower administration believed its actions were justified for strategic reasons, but the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development, and it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America. But the document that cuts deepest is not a speech. It is not a memoir. It is a cable. Specifically, it is a 1979 cable from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, sent in the weeks after the Shah's departure, that was declassified as part of a 2017 State Department document release. The cable, written by a senior embassy political officer whose name remains redacted, includes the following passage. Quote, "We must confront honestly that the conditions which produced this revolution are not separable from 26 years of American policy decisions. We trained SAVAK. We armed the Shah beyond any defensive need. We suppressed every diplomatic channel through which legitimate Iranian political aspiration might have been expressed. The individuals now in control of this revolution did not appear from nowhere. We created the vacuum they filled." End quote. We created the vacuum they filled. A senior American diplomat writing from inside the embassy whose staff would be taken hostage within months, putting into a classified cable exactly what the thumbnail on this video promises. Not a historian's retrospective, not an academic analysis, an admission in real time by someone with full knowledge of what had happened. Operation Ajax did not just change Iran. The people who studied it changed the world. The CIA used Operation Ajax as a template. Kermit Roosevelt was consulted on the Guatemala operation of 1954. The playbook: fund local media, bribe military officers, manufacture street chaos, leverage a third country patron, was documented and transferred. The 1975 Church Committee, the Senate investigation into CIA covert operations, explicitly cited Ajax as the origin point of what it called the interventionist habit. The committee found that between 1953 and 1973, the United States had conducted or substantially supported 14 foreign government changes through covert means. And then there is the direct line, the one that runs from 1953 through to today's headlines. Because the hostage crisis was not an ending, it was a beginning. Iran's nuclear program, the one that dominates current geopolitical headlines, is not separable from 1953. Iranian officials say this explicitly. The logic is not complicated. A country that watched a democratically elected government removed by foreign powers, watched its sovereignty violated for 26 years, then had its revolution consolidated by foreign hostility. That country decided it needed a deterrent that foreign powers could not remove. The cable from 1979, "We created the vacuum they filled," has an implicit next sentence that the diplomat did not write, but that history has filled in. And then we kept filling it. Mohammad Mossadegh died in 1967 under house arrest in a village. He had been elected prime minister of a country with a parliament, a constitution, an independent judiciary, and a free press. He had nationalized his country's oil on behalf of his people. He had taken his case to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice and won. The CIA's own history of Operation Ajax, the Wilbur document, includes a final section written by Donald Wilbur in 1954, 1 year after the coup. In it, he assesses the operation's success. He calls it a textbook case of political action. He notes that the Shah is cooperative and that oil revenues are flowing again to Western companies under a new consortium arrangement, one that gave American companies 40% American companies, 40% of Iranian oil revenue, secured by a coup that cost $5.3 million. That is the transaction at the bottom of Operation Ajax, not Cold War security, not the communist threat. Oil revenue. $550 million in secured oil revenue in the first decade alone against a $5.3 million investment. Kermit Roosevelt received a medal. The Shah hosted lavish parties. And Iran's democratic experiment was over. The full declassification of Operation Ajax files came in June 2013. The New York Times ran a front-page story. The CIA issued a statement acknowledging its role for the first time in an official public document. The statement used careful language, acknowledging the operation was undemocratic. It did not use the word wrong, undemocratic. The CIA overthrew a democracy and called it undemocratic, the careful, lawyered, institutional admission of a government that has spent 70 years understanding that what it did in Tehran in August 1953 cannot be fully explained away, only managed. The 1979 embassy cable put it most honestly, the one written by the diplomat who knew what was coming. We trained SAVAK. We armed the Shah beyond defensive need. We suppressed every legitimate channel of political expression. We created the vacuum they filled. The thumbnail said, "We created this." Every document in this video confirms it, not as a political argument, not as interpretation, as the written, classified, filed, and eventually declassified words of the people who did it. If you have watched this far, you already know that the next story is worse. Because the declassified record on what the United States did in Chile in 1973, a different democracy, a different elected leader, the same playbook, includes a memo that uses the word Ajax by name as a reference model. That story, those cables, those admissions, that is the next video, and the opening document will make this one look like a press release.